This week we're fitting a Snorkel air intake to our Audi TT. You sit back and I'll go get stuck in.
Alright, so when I say I'll get stuck in, what I really mean is Julia will get stuck in. The idea is that we get rid of the air box, but keep the airflow sensor, and then we can connect up a big 3-inch stainless steel tube to form the snorkel with. That's all fine and straightforward in principle. There is the slight problem that the engine bay on one of these is really crowded, and the bonnet curves down over the sides of the wings, so there's no obvious way to get the tube out. Hence the angle grinder. So we're going to mark and cut out a semicircle big enough to fit our tubing through. So here I'm marking out from a template ready to cut. And next I'm roughing out with a cutting wheel, and then finishing the job off with a grinding wheel, which is conveniently about the same size as the cutout I'm trying to make. And then it's rinse and repeat for the other side of the beam. What we're cutting through isn't the major structural element of the front end of the car, but nonetheless we are of course going to reinforce it afterwards with some sheet steel. So here we go, Mr. 2.5mm steel, meet Mr. Angle Grinder. We're cutting it a little bit oversized, it's always easier to trim it down afterwards. Next we take it to the bender and put in little incremental bends to get a semicircular shape. This came out a bit tighter than is perhaps ideal, so there'll be some adjustment with the hammers before we offer it up to the car. And then once we're happy that it's sitting right, we can take it and trim it down to size, ready to weld. We're going to start out with some quick tack welds. I like to go for 4, 1 at each corner, just to immobilize it properly before we start welding it in earnest. Once it's all in place, we can then seam weld it properly. I like to go for overlapping spot welds to ensure that we get good penetration without burning through. Now we can stick the pipe out the side, but we can't yet close the bonnet. Thinking about it, I've got just the tool to fix that with. It does pay to be at least slightly circumspect about it, so only after offering up the next section of pipe am I coming back to cut everything off. And then again at the front end, I'm trimming off enough that the bonnet nearly closes. And then for the rest, I'm actually going to modify the tube itself. Before I do that though, the downstream end of the tube needs a bit of a kink in it to point at the air mass meter better. So here I'm just cutting a sliver out of it, and then I can weld it back together, just tack welding it for the moment. And behold! Once you shut the bonnet, it looks like the world's biggest dump valve port. Next I'm going to make a template to mark out a saddle so that I can reduce the height of the pipe just where it passes under the edge of the bonnet. I'm going for a symmetrical shape with a curve at each end and roughly 30-degree sides. And yes, I could do the engineer thing and fire up the CAD, but paper's quicker and easier sometimes. Once the template's about right, we can transfer it to the pipe and then bust out the angle grinder again. Cue more ear-splitting noise, and while I may not be wearing gloves, you had best believe I've got ear defenders and eye protection on. Now we've got a nice big cutout. That's great for clearance with the bonnet, and really awful for being a snorkel, which is kind of the point. So we need a piece to fill it in with. Here I've got a spare piece of tube rolled out and beaten flat, and I used the aperture as cut as a template for shaping this too. As I was marking it up, getting ready to fold it, I could hear this noise. I didn't like this noise. I do admire the work ethic. I did encourage it to go elsewhere. It paid absolutely no attention, so the rest of this section was something of an uneasy standoff. I did not scream like a girl. The metal got shaped, and off we went outside to weld it. Again, just tack welds at first until we get the shape right. With this in place, we can turn our attention back to making the right sized cutout in the bonnet for it. A hole saw is a great time saver in soft aluminium for a curved shape. So with phase 1 completed, the bonnet closes, and now we can start thinking about the rest of the pipe. To create a nice mitered cut shape, what we actually need is a sinusoidal template like this. So we could just bosh in a single 90-degree bend, but 1, that would be ugly, and 2, it would incur quite a lot of air system losses as well. We need 2 45-degree bends in close proximity. About like this. Time for a few more tack welds to hold everything together, and then we're looking something like this. Now every time you lay down a weld, things distort slightly, so I figured now was probably a good time to weld everything up before we started adding the long pieces that will go up to the roof. Obviously the last thing you want is to tack it all together, get to the end, weld it all up and have it go banana shaped and become completely useless. With that done, we can cut ourselves the next piece to go along the top of the wing. And if, like me, you're wondering why he hasn't protected the windscreen against weld spatter, that's because he's an idiot. Anyway, he's not going to realise that until later, and in the meantime we can get on with welding up the next section. And then straight off the back of that, producing a bracket to weld to the pipe to support it off the front wing of the car. So this isn't going to be any more complex than it needs to be. It's a simple piece of preformed galvanized steel I had lying around. I'm just going to put 3 holes in it, trim it to shape with the grinder, and then weld it onto the pipe itself. And as ever, tack weld it with it in position, take it off the car to weld it up fully. Now we need fixing points in the wing itself, and here I'm just transferring the position of the drilled holes, but to create the fixing points themselves we're going to use Rrif nuts. This is a Rrif nut setting tool. Compared to some improvised methods of putting them in, I cannot recommend this highly enough. A Rrif nut is basically just a rivet with a threaded hole in the middle, and all you do is screw it down onto the mandrel and then insert it into the hole, as my glamorous assistant, me, will now demonstrate. Then you just squeeze the levers, which squashes the Rrif nut so that it grips the metal that you're setting it into. And then you simply unscrew the Rrif nut from the tool, leaving it set in the metal and ready to bolt into. One more in close-up, you get the general idea. Now that we've got the pipe mounted to the wing, we can start to think about running the rest of the snorkel up the windscreen pillar. Getting the right angle both to point it upwards and to lean it in to follow the curvature of the vehicle makes my thinkings hurt. So it's template time again, and then it's angle grinder time again. Well, arguably it's always angle grinder time, except when you're in the shower. Don't do that. We'll have a brief civilized pause for some measurement and marking out, and then it's angle grinder time again. Didn't need that bit of the bonnet. Now there's enough clearance to get everything to fit. We can line up and tack it in place, and if you're wondering why he's not protecting the windscreen against weld spatter, it's because he's still an idiot. Anyway, with it now partially seam welded, we need a bracket to support the free end of the pipe up at roof level. Having cut 2 pieces the same size, I'm clamping them together to drill them, as otherwise the holes will never line up properly. Having made the 2 brackets, one gets tack welded to the car roof and the other gets tack welded to the snorkel. Did I mention it's a good idea to protect the window glass while you're about it? Anyway, here I am welding one half of the pair to the snorkel, and then a bit of cleaning up with the angle grinder, and we're ready to bolt it to the car. And here we are, definitely starting to look like a snorkel.
So at this point we had a bit of a decision to make. We can't really leave an open pipe like that sticking straight up. It'll ingest, I don't know, leaves, rainwater, birds, small animals. It's a bit big and a bit open. It needs some sort of filter on it. Sounds like the police. Maybe they're coming for me. Let's try that again. We need to terminate it either pointing forwards or pointing backwards. And the internet's full of advice. Not really intended for a post-apocalyptic hairdresser's car with a remarkably low roof. If you point it forwards, then when you're doing 150 miles an hour on the autobahn, you get a bit of a ram effect, which helps the engine to breathe better. But you've probably noticed this isn't altogether about building a 150 mile an hour barnstormer. Not really. You also ingest stones and dust and dirt more readily with a forward-facing intake. Backwards, on the other hand, yeah, the engine doesn't breathe so well at high speed, but it does mean that rainwater doesn't make the turn so well to go down the inlet. So on that basis, yeah, backwards it is.
But we're not quite ready to finish off the top of the snorkel yet. See, you remember that we slashed the side of the bonnet off to make space? We kind of need to tidy that up. So here's a piece of edging trim that we'll rivet in place just to keep the sharp edges away from anyone's fingers. We're making it out of formed and riveted aluminium because the rest of the bonnet is aluminium too. Anyway, where were we? Backwards facing intake. Needs one last angled cut and weld. I actually don't have the weld footage, but hey, at least it wasn't near window glass this time. And then we can lop the whole thing down to length. To stop the cone filter slipping off once I've clamped it on, I'm using this homemade beading tool just to put a lip on the end of the pipe. It's a really handy tool. It's a pair of mole grips adapted for more leverage and given some shaped jaws. Next up, the filter itself. The seller said, do you want blue or red? So I got pink. But that's okay. This filter goes on that pipe and bingo. We'll keep an eye on it to see whether the filter needs enclosing, but in the meantime, our Audi TT has a custom full stainless snorkel air intake system. And I'm pretty sure there aren't many TTs that can say that. Well, that rounds out this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.